Hello students, I hope you are doing well. Today we are going to discuss about the history of intelligence test. Interest in intelligence dates back thousands of years, but it wasn't until the psychologist Alfred Binet was commissioned to identify students who needed educational assistance that the first intelligence quotient IQ test was born. Although it has its own limitations and it has many lookalikes that use far less rigorous measurements, Binet's IQ test is well known around the world as a way to compare the intelligence. So the first person to commission the IQ test or intelligence test was Alfred Binet. He was asked to identify the students who required the educational assistant in Paris school. So we will go back to the history of intelligence. During the early 1900s, the French government asked Binet to help decide which students were the most likely to experience difficulty in the school. The government had passed laws requiring that all the French students attend school, so it was important to find a way to identify children who would need a specialized assistance. So it was a French psychologist Alfred Binet who was asked to find out the students who required a special assistant in the school, and so that they can divide the children in less with low IQ and higher IQ. Binet and his colleague Theodore Simon began developing questions that focused on areas not explicitly taught in schools, such as attention, memory, and problem-solving skills, which we already discussed in chapter 4. Using these questions, Binet determined which ones served as the best predictors of school success. He quickly realized that some children were able to answer more advanced questions that older children were generally able to answer, and vice versa. Based on his observation, Binet suggested the concept of mental age, or a measure of intelligence based on the average ability of children of a certain age group. So Binet suggested mental age, that is MA, that is the overall mental development of a person, is known as mental age, and we know the formula for the IQ is MA upon CA into 100, wherein MA stands for the mental age. So mental age is the capability where a child performs, at what age level the child is going to perform. On that basis the mental development is been found out. First IQ test. The first intelligence test, referred to today as Binet-Simon scale, became the basis of intelligence tests still in use today. However, Binet himself did not believe that his psychometric instruments could be used to measure a single permanent and inborn level of intelligence. Binet stressed the limitation of the test, suggesting that intelligence is far too broad concept to quantify with a single number. Instead, he insisted that intelligence is influenced by many factors, that it changes over time, and it can only be compared in the children with similar background. So then onwards, Stanford and Binet developed together a Stanford-Binet intelligence test. When the Binet-Simon scale was brought to United States, it generated considerable interest in Stanford University psychologist Lewis Terman took Binet's original test and standardized it using a sample of American participants. This adapted test was first published in 1916 and was called as Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale, and soon became a standard intelligence test that was used in US. Okay, so what happened over here is that Lewis Terman took interest in a Binet scale, and it got published, it got standardized in Stanford University, and thus then it was called as Stanford-Binet intelligence test, and it was first published in 1916 in US. The Stanford-Binet intelligence test used a single number known as intelligence quotient or IQ to represent an individual's score on the test. The Stanford-Binet remains a popular assessment tool today, despite going through a number of revisions over the years since its inception. So this requires it only works on the IQ quotient. So on the basis of IQ quotient, they can easily find out where the individual stands, and this is even used today. So we will see the pros and the cons of IQ testing. At the outset of World War I, US Army officials were faced with the task of screening an enormous number of recruits. In 1970, as a chair of the Committee on the Psychological Examination of Recruits, psychologist Robert Werkes developed two tests known as Army Alpha and Army Beta test. So this was a psychologist who developed the two important tests of known as Army Alpha and Army Beta to recruit the US Army in 1917. Wechsler also developed two different tests specifically for the use with children: the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children and Wechsler's Preschool and Pre-Primary Scale of Intelligence known as WPPSI. The adult version of the test has been revised since the original publication and is known as WAIS 4. So these were also the various cons of the IQ test that we saw earlier of Stanford-Binet, because it was not dealing with the children, and thus the David Wechsler is a person who also developed the IQ scale specifically for the children known as WISC and WPPSI. Okay, and the adult intelligence scale is known as WAIS. We will see WAIS much more in detail because recently WAIS 4 and WAIS 5 is used for IQ testing. The WAIS 4 contains 10 subtests along with 5 supplementary tests. The test provides a score in 4 major areas of intelligence, that is a verbal comprehension scale, a perceptual reasoning scale, a working memory scale, and processing speed scale. So all these 4 factors are being measured on WAIS 4 and WAIS 5. So this isn't given in your textbook, but still, as you are psychology students, you must be aware what actually the WAIS 4 and WAIS 5 is in it. Okay, so this is the additional knowledge that I am providing you. The test also provides 2 broad scores that can be used as a summary of overall intelligence. The full-scale IQ score combines of performance on all 4 index score, and general ability index is based on the 6 subtests. So what is happening over here in short is that if you give the test, the 4 test scores you will get, then again you will get a score of full scale. So it would be again divided into 2, that is performance score and general ability score. So 6 tests would be of performance and 6 test subtests would be of your general ability. Rather than scoring the test based on the chronological and mental age, the WAIS is scored by comparing the score of taker scores to the scores of others in the same age group. So over here, what happened in IQ test of Stanford and Stanford-Binet test was that they used to give a formula of IQ is equal to MA upon CA into 100. Okay, so since our chronological age keeps on increasing, there could be a problem in computation of the score. So instead of computing with the formula of IQ is equal to MA upon CA into 100, what WAIS actually does is it compares the average score of an individual, which is fixed at 100. So 100 IQ is your average IQ score. If you get 70 as your IQ, then you are below average. If you get 115 as your IQ, then you are above average. So Weiss has kept 100 as the average score for the IQ, and on the basis of that, entire population IQ is been checked. Okay, so this is like a basic score that they have put up by doing the testing, of course. But this is the major, we can say, the drawback of Stanford-Binet test, and wherein the Weiss plays an important role, where it checks upon the average score and it compares the score of the same age group. Okay, so the average score is fixed at 100, with the 2/3 of the score lying in the normal age range between 85 and 115. So every age group has a different scoring, right? And this is known as a Weiss scoring. This scoring method has become a standard technique in intelligence testing and is also used for the modern world revision of Stanford-Binet test. So earlier this was a major drawback of Stanford-Binet test, but since Weiss is using this kind of scoring system, so it was found out that it is very helpful and it is helping in IQ scoring. So then, even after updating its version, Stanford-Binet accepted this kind of scoring system for IQ testing. Alright, so next we are going to see the video which talks about the history of intelligence in much more detail.
In 1905, psychologists Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon designed a test for children who were struggling in school in France. Designed to determine which children required individualized attention, their method formed the basis of the IQ test. Beginning in the late 19th century, researchers hypothesized that cognitive abilities like verbal reasoning, working memory, and visual spatial skills reflected an underlying general intelligence, or G factor. Simon and Binet designed a battery of tests to measure each of these abilities and combine the results into a single score. Questions were adjusted for each age group, and a child's score reflected how they performed relative to others their age. Dividing someone's score by their age and multiplying the result by 100 yielded the intelligence quotient, or IQ. Today, a score of 100 represents the average of a sample population, with 68% of the population scoring within 15 points of 100. Simon and Binet thought the skills their test assessed would reflect general intelligence. But both then and now, there's no single agreed-upon definition of general intelligence. And that left the door open for people to use the test in service of their own preconceived assumptions about intelligence. What started as a way to identify those who needed academic help quickly became used to sort people in other ways, often in service of deeply flawed ideologies. One of the first large-scale implementations occurred in the United States during World War I, when the military used an IQ test to sort recruits and screen them for officer training. At that time, many people believed in eugenics, the idea that desirable and undesirable genetic traits could and should be controlled in humans through selective breeding. There were many problems with this line of thinking, among them the idea that intelligence was not only fixed and inherited, but also linked to a person's race. Under the influence of eugenics, scientists used the results of the military initiative to make erroneous claims that certain racial groups were intellectually superior to others. Without taking into account that many of the recruits tested were new immigrants to the United States who lacked formal education or English language exposure, they created an erroneous intelligence hierarchy of ethnic groups. The intersection of eugenics and IQ testing influenced not only science, but policy as well. In 1924, the state of Virginia created policy allowing for the forced sterilization of people with low IQ scores, a decision the United States Supreme Court upheld. In Nazi Germany, the government authorized the murder of children based on low IQ. Following the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement, the discriminatory uses of IQ tests were challenged on both moral and scientific grounds. Scientists began to gather evidence of environmental impacts on IQ. For example, as IQ tests were periodically recalibrated over the 20th century, new generations scored consistently higher on old tests than each previous generation. This phenomenon, known as the Flynn effect, happened much too fast to be caused by inherited evolutionary traits. Instead, the cause was likely environmental: improved education, better healthcare, and better nutrition. In the mid-20th century, psychologists also attempted to use IQ tests to evaluate things other than general intelligence, particularly schizophrenia, depression, and other psychiatric conditions. These diagnoses relied in part on the clinical judgment of the evaluators and used a subset of the tests used to determine IQ. A practice later research found does not yield clinically useful information. Today, IQ tests employ many similar design elements and types of questions as the early tests, though we have better techniques for identifying potential bias in the test. They're no longer used to diagnose psychiatric conditions, but a similarly problematic practice using subtest scores is still sometimes used to diagnose learning disabilities, against the advice of many experts. Psychologists around the world still use IQ tests to identify intellectual disability, and the results can be used to determine appropriate educational support, job training, and assisted living. IQ test results have been used to justify horrific policies and scientifically baseless ideologies. That doesn't mean the test itself is worthless. In fact, it does a good job of measuring the reasoning and problem-solving skills it sets out to. But that isn't the same thing as measuring a person's potential. Though there are many complicated political, historical, scientific, and cultural issues wrapped up in IQ testing, more and more researchers agree on this point and reject the notion that individuals can be categorized by a single numerical score. Speaking of questionable testing practices, should we get rid of standardized testing altogether? Find out what these tests actually measure with this video, or learn more about the infamous and oft misused Rorschach test with this video.